a round of applause for Alan. Thanks very much for
Thanks, Declan. Hi, everybody. So I'm going to talk today mostly about the apartment gem for multi-tenancy. So I came at this not knowing anything practical about multi-tenancy, so I'm going to share with you the experience that we had of, for the first time, trying to create a multi-tenancy application. Turned out that the setup is just as one would hope. It works very well. It's very straightforward. So we're going to look at the setup for this application that we have, a couple of gotchas, and that's about it. So yeah, it's a pretty positive experience all around. So the metaphors that come in here, so if we look at each floor here as a single rich tenant, then so the apartment gem has the elevator idea. They use the elevators to switch tenant. So if we see the elevator as bringing us to a different floor, then we have our apartment with a tenant per floor and the elevator as the mechanism for switching tenant in a regular apartment block. Yeah, so talking about it because this is something we did recently, set up this application. The setup was quite straightforward. So we came into it without, it was kind of a sideline hobby project, so it wasn't something that we were able to invest much developer resources or money into. So if it was to be feasible, it had to just work and not be any more complicated than, much more complicated than a single tenant application. And that turned out to be the case. So it's very accessible to, modest developer resources and financial resources. It's very easily done. So I thought that was pretty cool that it's, it's such a powerful thing is available to all developers. So that's why I'm talking about this. So another thing I think is pretty cool is the search for exoplanets, but I'm not going to talk about that today. So we're stuck with multi-tenancy on Rails. So my profile piece here. So my email address. I have this company to keep me out of a real job, which is nice. So we put spreadsheets on the internet, as one does, which spreadsheets, as we know, are very serious. So that's very serious business. And it allows us to do some other more interesting projects as well. So under the kind of brand or domain name, Simple School Admin, we have an administration app for language schools for their day-to-day administration, students, enrollments, payments. That's going a few years in Italy as it happens. And then related to that, more recently, we have this multi-tenancy app. So the domain here is, there's around 3,000 language schools around the world that are accredited for Cambridge English exams as exam centers. So all of these language schools have a similar need to allow their candidates to register and pay online. So by registering online, entering their own details into a web app, those details that will ultimately appear on their certificate, all going well for the exam, it shifts responsibility from the school onto the candidate to get those details correct. So most schools are still doing kind of paper form and a lot of internal administration. So a very simple application for each school to provide their students with a form to pick their exam, register, and pay for it online. So kind of limited market, it's not a pot of gold, low margin business. So to be feasible, we'd need to be able to have a simple setup so that we could roll out a similar solution to each client. Another recent project is virtual language immersion, which is very popular now amongst language faculties and universities to do kind of peer language exchanges as a formal part of their language courses. So somewhat related to the other. So yeah, just putting that up there. If we use contract programmers mostly, but if someone feels like maybe doing some very serious work or some more interesting work and not really getting paid, but maybe we could talk about other options, that's what we do. So looking at kind of Google multi-tenancy, and it gave me kind of three options. I only really could think of two. So the first one I put the question mark on, it does say that one option is to have separate database instances within a single web application. I don't really know how that would work or what the advantage would be of having entirely separate databases run under a single web application rather than just have a separate app for each one. It could still have a shared common code base. So I'm not going to talk about that. Another option that was considered for this project was to manage the scoping of data for the different clients within the application logic. So just a quick look at examples that others had put online for that. I think this one is Basecamp, and they've, kind of every controller has a scoping mechanism, in this case related to the user, to ensure that only the data that they are linked to, in this case, is made available. Another one here, Ryan Biggs, I think, maybe a bit more similar. So they've some kind of company here, and they've a controller filter to ensure that only the data for the correct company. But this filled me full of dread because it just looked like extra complexity within the application logic. And maybe we'd forget something, or even if we didn't, when we're maintaining it, it's just more code, and it wasn't a very attractive approach. So that left us with the multi-tenancy approach of having separate database schemas within a single database, so as to remove that complexity into the gem and not to have to worry about it within our application logic, so we can write our Rails code the way we're used to within a single tenant application. So the situation here, the context was these language schools, and we want to provide each school with a subdomain on our domain. And effectively, these are separate web applications, or certainly the client thinks of it as their web application. So they'll put their link on their website for their students to register in their set of exams. In this case, the user model is per tenant. So each school has their own set of users. So maybe one student would study 1 year at one school, move to another school the following year, but there should be no, in this case, no connection between their separate web applications. So the user, we'd want them to create a new user account with the other school. I kind of thought that would have been the default approach for multi-tenancy, but the video linked on the README of the apartment gem and a couple of other examples seem to sort of default to users being global, so that once you have a user account with the web application on any subdomain, that's it. You have your user account for all subdomains, and then a different case, but we could look at the setup to achieve this. It is described in the README. It's just not the default kind of setup for multi-tenancy. But in our case, yeah, each client's app or each tenant needs a separate set of user records. And we do also have some shared data, like global data, that we provide to all of the clients. So these annually, Cambridge University publishes the list of exam dates. So it's kind of a global centralized authority that says these are the total list of 200 or 300 sessions that are available in the year. And then each school picks from them which ones they're going to run. So it's kind of nice. We have a centralized source of data there that we can provide through the app to each client. So that shared data will go in a public schema. And we as the application developers, we make that data available, and then each client gets it in a read-only way. So the gem itself, there's a lot of information in the README, which is nice. So we're going to take a few things out of that and look at the kind of really minimum required configuration to get it working, which is quite straightforward, which is nice. So standard, put our apartment gem in gem file, bundle install. That gives us a generator. So if we run Rails generate apartment install, it creates an initializer file, apartment.orb, in our config initializers folder. And that has lots of config options, mostly commented out. So then next in the README, it gives the kind of basic code that achieves the multi-tenancy, so that we have a apartment tenant create, tenant name. In our case, it's going to be the same as the subdomain. We'll have one tenant per subdomain. So that seems pretty straightforward. Similar for switching tenants, apartment tenant switch. So first time reading this, we're thinking, okay, that seems straightforward, but don't really want to have to switch the tenants, do we? It's not the whole point that this is done under the bonnet, but yeah, it will be. So that is the code to do it, but we generally don't have to worry about this once it's set up. So it does say here, when a switch is called, all requests coming to active record will be routed to the tenant you specified to return to the root tenant, call switch with no arguments. So when we create a new tenant, all migrations will be run against that tenant. So if our app is up and running and we're in progress and we get a new client, we'll create a new tenant, and at that point it will run all the migrations we have for that new kind of empty database schema to bring it up to date with the rest of the app, like for a new app. And then thereafter, each time we add a new model, add a new migration, it will run once for every database schema. So that's all handled by the gem, which is nice. So switching tenants per request, that's what we want to do in this case. So you can have apartment root the appropriate tenant by adding some rack middleware. Okay, apartment can support many different elevators. It talks about rack middleware again. So anyway, thankfully, we don't need to be experts in rack middleware to get this configured and working nicely. So I just put a big line through this because I misread this. It says here, if you're not using the generator, and then the README has a lot of code, a lot of the configuration code in application.orb. But if you do use the generator, then we don't need any configuration in application.orb. It's all in the initializer, obviously. So yeah, so just maybe to note that the README has kind of a lot of application.orb configuration, which kind of goes against the initializer approach that it recommends at the start. But it's the same in effect. So switching tenant on subdomain. So this from the README, they also do this, it would appear. In-house, we use the subdomain elevator, which analyzes the subdomain of the request and switches to a tenant schema of the same name. So very straightforward. So we can follow that convention whereby we will use the subdomain that we actually give our clients, their school name or a shortened version of it. We'll use that as the name of the tenant in the underlying database. You can do the very same thing. Postgres, well, in this case, Postgres database, create a tenant with either like mimic live production tenants or just create a sample one of our own. Like it'll always give us the public tenant, and then you just create one. Is that what you mean in the console? Yeah. But sorry, yeah, to actually, yeah, for the REB requests. Yeah, so that won't work. So you do need to put in a subdomain. So there's an LVH, it's in the README, an lvh.me domain available, which we can just use, which obviously just points back to our local host. And we can put a subdomain on that. And it points back to our local host, and our local web server receives that as a web request with that subdomain. And then if we haven't created the tenant in our database, we'll get that error saying, you can put in any subdomain, and you'll get that apartment error saying tenant named whatever we typed in, not found. So yeah. If
you're on a Mac, click O, you can take subdomains.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, because you're right. The regular localhost 3000 won't give us a subdomain. Yeah. So the kind of basic setup for in the initializer here. Excluded models. So excluded models are excluded from the multi-tenancy facility, which means that it's data records that aren't scoped by tenant. So I think of it as shared or global data. So we come back to that. We can have a look. So a lot of them have the user model here, for example. But in our case, user model is a separate set of records per tenant. So we're not passing that to the excluded models. The subdomain elevator is included by default. It's the active elevator in the initializer that's created, so that's nice. The last line there needs to be added separately. It is described in the README, but it's not in the initializer by default. So that's if using devise, we need this configuration here to ensure that works correctly. And that's the basic setup. And once that's in place, with a couple of gotchas, I mean, it doesn't need to take very long at all to set up a multi-tenancy app. So tenant model. So typically we'll create a tenant model in our own database, which will kind of maybe think of it as a proxy to the actual database tenants. So one-to-one, we'll create a record, tenant record for each of our schemas. As I see it, this is not necessarily necessary, but it seems to be the convention to do this, and it can be a useful place as well to hold other information about the tenant, about the client company. So we use it to hold like the company name, the address, telephone number of the client company. Could go in a YAML file as well, but and yeah, so we'll also hold the name of the database schema, which will match that in the apartment tenant. So this is our tenant model. So we have a class method here to create a sample tenant, so just to get up and running. And then particularly in early stages, we're dropping the database, recreating it, just an easy way to get our sample into the development. Actually, we use this in production as well. So we have a sample subdomain, so we can use as a demo to point people towards. So the DB name is the attribute we gave our tenant model to hold the tenant name. And all the rest is just kind of information that we want to hold about the company. So company name, telephone number, a couple of email addresses. And we're also holding the Stripe keys here. Obviously, this is not a real company, so we have test keys here. And these are the test keys in production that we can use, that allow us to go in and do demo payments on the sample subdomain. So we have a callback here. We all love callbacks. So I think in this case it's fair enough. So we're making it explicit that we have a one-to-one between our tenant model and an apartment tenant in the database. So anytime we create a tenant model, we're doing it with the intention that we are actually going to have a database schema or tenant of the same name. So the callback runs that code from the README to create the database schema tenant. There's code to drop a tenant if and when needed as well there. Then we have a couple of helper methods. So these we only ever use from the console. So we're doing the tenant switching happens based on the web requests on the subdomain. So only ever we need to switch in the console. We don't have this anywhere in our application code, which is nice. So class method there, tenant switch, give it the tenant name. It'll switch the apartment tenant and then return us our tenant model if we need to pick off some company information. So pretty straightforward. Another, like one of the blog posts we were looking at had some more code there to say return the current tenant that was scoping the data. And we found we'd no use for this, given that we're only switching tenants in the console. The console always brings us to the public tenant when we log in. So we'll always explicitly switch to whatever tenant we're looking for the data in. So we found we didn't need this, but just showing it here for, so we can see the tenant, apartment tenant.current method there that it provides us to tell us what tenant it's currently on. Yeah, but we didn't need, yeah. At the start, we always forgot to switch tenants when we went in. So we go into the console to whatever one goes into the console for to look at some piece of data, do our usual model where no data, freak out, but then just remember we hadn't switched tenants. So once we got used to that, it worked fine. Last bit of setup we had for the initializer was to pass it the list of tenant names, which it needs to know for migrations, what schemas to run them against. So now we can pick our tenant names out of our tenant model and pass it in the initializer to the gem. And it says there, so in order to migrate all of your tenants or Postgres schemas, you need to provide a list of databases to apartment. So a quick look at, there's a few different types of elevators. We're using the quite simple one of one subdomain to one tenant, which is nice and clean. But then we're wondering, what if we had a client who didn't want to use our domain, a subdomain on our domain? Say if they have their domain and they want a subdomain on that they point back to us, which would be fair enough. So it was good to see that seems to be pretty easily accomplished. We just switch out our configuration to use this host hash elevator, and we can always just map any host name that they provide us with to the name of the tenant in our database. Now, I'm not sure, but I guess if we do it for one, maybe we have to then list out all of our subdomains here and point them explicitly to a tenant name, but at least we know it's easily done. One other configuration option is to pass excluded subdomains. So these would be subdomains that the elevator would ignore. It wouldn't switch tenant for these, so presumably they'd end up in the app would be in the public tenant for these. Now, as that happens, our www subdomain, we have a separate Rails app for that, so it doesn't come into play. Initially, we were going to create for our internal use, a managed subdomain. Thought we would use this we'd go in on this subdomain in order to update and insert the excluded model data, the shared data across all tenants. But in the end, we decided against having a subdomain just for internal use, and we just put another Boolean on the user model, and then so anyone who's an administrator and kind of the internal code administrator, we can get at those web forms in the admin app to do those, to edit the shared data.
Sorry, repeat that. So an administrator can see all.
So yeah, so we like a Boolean just for Rail developer administrators, application developers, and we have a regular kind of admin part of the app for the individual clients administrators, and then also like a super user account whereby we've extra web forms that we can go in and edit the data that they all see, which is that global list of calendar dates.
But can a super user access all subdomains? So if somebody who may want to list, for example, all organizations or all whatever it is.
Yeah. I mean, once you have an account, so actually for like a student, there's no, we can look at there's OAuth, and once you have your Gmail, there's no confirm step, so you can get straight in. Obviously, you need to be officially authorized as an administrator to get at your own company's data in the back end, see all the registrations. We haven't built a kind of a cross-client administrative interface to look at all of our clients' data. No.
Is that possible?
It's possible. Yeah. We have access to the full database, but it doesn't sound very ethical. But yeah, I suppose if for some reason we did want to look at all clients' data, it's all there. So instead of having our own subdomain, we just put a before action to authorize our super user administrator for those excluded models. A couple of gotchas, not many. One was the table name method for active record, which gives us the name of the database table, obviously. returns the name prefixed with public in the case of excluded models that sit in whose data is only held in the public schema. Whereas on the regular models that are scoped per client, per tenant, it doesn't. So it gives us what it usually gives us, which is just the name of the table. So not entirely sure why, but that caused a little bit of searching in some generic code for running queries. The queries would fail because it would have the extra public. So we just strip that out of the table name. Yeah, so that was one of the only really unusual kind of side effects that affected other generic code that we use across applications, which isn't too bad. Another issue, which I'm not entirely sure if it's related to the multi-tenancy, although it hasn't happened in our other applications, was that after running a PG backup capture, we'd get a SIGTERM fault in Heroku, and the app wouldn't restart itself, so we just have to manually Heroku restart. So easily worked around, but better to know about it in case the app is down. So then we need our SSL certificate. So again, wanted this to be simple, straightforward, and quite cheap. So we didn't fancy paying $100 for each subdomain, or even for one. So this site offers free digital certificates, and it allows us to put in multiple subdomains for a single certificate, which is pretty cool. Now, we need to list them all in advance. I don't think there's a way to edit a certificate. So if we get a new client and we hadn't anticipated the name, I think you'll need to cancel or need to create a new certificate and list all the up to 100 URLs, subdomains again in the new certificate. But it is free. So we had one little gotcha in the setup there. I think we had to first, to verify the ownership of the domain name with the certificate provider, we had to do so with the non-SSL Heroku URL first, because that's the only one that could be accessed in advance of the certificate being in place. Then once that was done, switch the CNAME records to the SSL URL, the herokudns.com. I don't remember the exact details now. I took these notes if anyone's interested, or if someone hits the same issue again, we can look at our CNAME records. But yeah, it worked fine. So free digital SSL certificate. So for the hosting, it used to be SSL endpoints, right, which I think are $20, $30 a month, but they now provide free SSL and we don't need a separate specific Heroku SSL endpoint. Free SSL on any dyno that isn't the free dyno. So the cheapest dyno, being the hobby dyno, is $7 a month. As a bonus, it doesn't go to sleep. And that's it. So once that's in place, it works. Obviously, with low volumes, that works fine. And the only explicit expense is the Heroku $7 a month to have a multi-tenancy app. I think that's it. So one other thing I said I'd look at is we have a simple API. Yeah, so we have a simple API to provide. So these schools will typically have their own admin system. So simple API to provide the data of their students that have registered for which exams back into so they can pull it into their admin system and do their normal invoicing and keep their data consistent if they're entering registrations manually into yeah. Control plus.
I wouldn't chance it.
Yeah. Okay.
On a Mac, it's like, I don't know. Anyone on a Mac know what the zoom in thing on preview is?
You come close.
Yeah, everyone come to the front. I presume it's Command plus. So, does this work? Oh yeah, there you go.
Oh yeah, he's right.
Oh my God. First you go on about POW, now it's you're pinching, you're an expert. How's that at the back? Is that looking okay? Yeah. Just there you go.
Cool, thanks.
Swipe up and down.
Oh yeah, nice. So yeah, very very simple API to provide the data back to their calling web app, to their calling from their admin system, to their admin system. So I had to look at this to remind myself, but so this also used the subdomain tenant switching, and so they will call the URL with using this authenticate or request with HTTP token. So they'll embed the token in the request, and we can use that to ensure that the request is coming from a user that is authorized to access the API. And again, given that our users are scoped by client, we know that they're entitled to get the data for that tenant. So that's a before filter, before action, I believe we're supposed to call it now. For API controller, a parent class for API controllers, which we inherit from here. Oh yeah, there we go. So this is just an index action for a resource, which is the bookings, the registrations, candidate registrations. So we'll call our model here, which because we have our apartment elevator, it will scope this data for the specific tenant. So we get the full set of records here. There's a filter by date just to give them the relevant records back. We serialize the records and send them back as JSON. I think, do we have, yeah, so the controller we're inheriting from has respond to JSON here, so that will default the respond here to send back JSON data in the response. So that our serializer we have here, yeah. So the serializer is simply just lists the attributes that we want to send them back. So very simple to actually all the complexity here is on the calling application side. So this needs to sift through which are new registrations, which ones it's already booked, if ones have changed. So that's all on their side. We just send them back their full list every time they call. That's all. Any questions on anything there?
Just saw that you raised Postgres. Is that possible to use NGN?
Yeah, it seems pretty agnostic as to which database you use, even within Postgres. Details for the way. So yeah, the apartment gen is not specific to Postgres, and what I can say is that it works very straightforward with Postgres.
And these application was a new one, or do you migrate to the?
Yeah, we had started the application before we made it multi-tenancy. So effectively, yeah, it was a migration of an existing app to multi-tenancy, and it was fine. Yeah, yeah. So it doesn't have to be there from the get-go at all. Mm. Do you want to see the app, maybe? Do we have? How are we for time, Declan? Yeah. Do you have a web browser on your computer? Oh, I passed one. All right. Oh.
Command T. Or the plus.
Oh, yeah, yeah. So we have our sample subdomain, simple school admin.com. Remember, do we need, oh no, HTTPS is automatically nice. So we have login by either create a user record manually, username, password, confirm password, or OAuth for Google or Facebook. If you're logged into Google, Declan, can I register you in a dummy, sure? Yeah. Dummy exam? Yeah. Your English is very good. So, yeah. So we created a user record in our sample tenant called sample. So it's providing us here with a list of, from the 200 or 300 globally available exams, exam dates provided by Cambridge. The school administrator has gone in and selected from those excluded models from the public shared data, which ones to make available to their candidates. So that's what we're seeing here. So, so Declan's doing the CET level, I believe. I don't know what CET is, but yeah. So we filter on CET, computer. Select our exam. Say we're not an existing student. So we have the Faker gem. Faker gem is cool. So Faker gem because this is on the sample domain, to set all the values in the web form, which is nice. So it's a single form to keep things simple for the user. So we'll say forget to accept terms and conditions. Gives us our usual errors. Good, try again. Create our registration. Prompt us to check the details. We can go back and edit or pay with our Stripe. So test mode comes up in the top right there for if Stripe knows that it's a test API key that we have in place on this app, and puts that little yellow test mode icon up, and allows us to use this dummy card number to not pay, but kind of pay with any future dated expiry date and 3-digit CVC. And you're signed up, Declan? Yeah, that was quick. We haven't even got the...
I hope we're still 50 euro.
Funny, it's still hanging there. So that's it. That's the app. I don't know why it's hanging there. It doesn't usually do that.
Question:
Yeah.
Is there a definition difference between multi-tenant as you have it there, subdomains or different database instances or whatever it is, and let's say doing it through a database structure?
Structure being...
So let's say you hang everything off an organization.
Oh yeah,
so
yeah.
User is a member of an organization, and then you use something like Funded to help you.
Yeah.
Is that?
That's done as well, yeah. So I found loads of a few examples of people doing it that way. I just didn't want the extra complexity within the application.
Okay.
Yeah, of course, doable, but just worried we'd forget something, or, well, mainly that we'd forget something. I mean, it is data security at the end of the day. Oh yeah. If you do it right, it's yeah. Application error.
Do you have any experience with taking that multi-tenant database and then doing something further processing the data, like indexing and Elasticsearch, stuff like that? Is that more complex?
No, all we did, I did download the database from Heroku with the multiple schemas in production, restore it locally, and it worked fine. Yeah, so that's all I can say definitively, which was nice. Yeah. Maybe I've seen people mention maybe performance issues in backing up and stuff, but yeah. Yeah, I don't know. I'd be curious to know as well. Yeah. So for our serious work, we use AWS virtual private network and stuff. But yeah, I don't know. they still work fine for me. Yeah. Yeah. Does anyone have experience with Heroku, or has anyone moved off Heroku?
One reason for moving off it is for medical grade applications.
Yeah, sure.
It doesn't cover either does AWS.
Right. What does?
There are HIPAA compliant
Right.
services that